Dawn, August 17, 1943. Dobodura Airfield, New Guinea. The air hangs thick with humidity and the metallic tang of avgas. Mist clings to the red clay runway, curling around the twin booms of a P-38 Lightning like ghostly fingers. Beneath its left wing, Technical Sergeant James McKenna kneels in the damp grass, his grease-streaked coveralls soaked at the knees. At 7:42 a.m., he watches as Lieutenant Robert Hayes, 23, lean, eyes shadowed by sleepless dread, straps into the cockpit. 6 combat missions, 0 kills. Tomorrow, his mother will receive a letter from the War Department unless something changes today. To the north, beyond the Owen Stanley Range, 18 Mitsubishi A6M0s streak toward this very patch of sky. They fly with the arrogant precision of hunters who've tasted blood too many times. The P-38 beside McKenna is fast. It climbs like a dream. It carries enough firepower to shred a bomber in seconds. But in a turning fight over the jungle canopy, it has been dying, again and again, like a wounded bull elephant circling too slowly before the final spear. McKenna knows why. Not because of doctrine, not because of courage, but because of a flaw hidden in plain sight, buried in a bundle of control cables running through the aircraft's tail booms. A flaw so small, so technically within spec, that engineers in Burbank dismissed it as irrelevant. Last night, McKenna violated Army Air Force's Regulation 6517. He cut 6 inches of piano wire from a wrecked fighter, bent it into a Z shape, slipped it into Hayes's left aileron system like a whispered prayer. Now, as the engines roar to life and the P-38 taxis toward the runway, McKenna doesn't salute. He just watches, because in 17 minutes, either a farm boy from Iowa will shoot down 3 zeros, or another coffin will be loaded onto a C-47 bound for San Francisco. The propellers blur, the lightning lifts, and the war in the Pacific takes a silent, unrecorded turn. By mid-1943, the war in the Southwest Pacific had settled into a brutal rhythm of attrition, isolation, and improvisation. The Japanese Empire, having seized vast territories from Malaya to the Solomon Islands in the opening months of the war, now found its overextended lines under relentless pressure. General Douglas MacArthur's Southwest Pacific Area Command had launched a methodical island-hopping campaign, clawing back territory through combined arms operations anchored by air superiority. At the heart of that effort sat the 5th Air Force, reborn from the ashes of the defeated Far East Air Force after the fall of the Philippines in 1942. New Guinea, a sprawling island of mountainous jungle and malaria-ridden swamps, had become the critical battleground. Japanese forces clung to strongholds at Wewak, Madang, and Lae, using them as springboards to threaten Allied supply lines to Australia. American and Australian troops inched forward along the rugged Kokoda Track, while engineers carved rudimentary airstrips out of the jungle floor, Dobodura among them. These strips were little more than packed coral and gravel, baked by equatorial sun and turned to mud by monsoon rains. Yet they served as lifelines for the P-38 Lightning. The Lockheed P-38 had arrived in the theater in early 1942 as America's answer to long-range escort and interception needs. Twin-engine, twin-boom, tricycle gear, it looked unlike any other fighter in the sky. Designed by Clarence Kelly Johnson's team at Lockheed, it boasted a top speed over 400 miles per hour, a service ceiling above 30,000 feet, and devastating firepower. 4 50-caliber machine guns and a 20-millimeter cannon, all concentrated in the nose. Its range, nearly 1,300 miles with drop tanks, made it ideal for the vast distances of the Pacific. But the P-38 was never meant to dogfight. In Europe, where it first saw combat, the Lightning excelled in high-altitude bomber escort and hit-and-run interception. Its turbo-supercharged engines gave it unmatched performance above 20,000 feet. But in New Guinea, combat rarely occurred that high. The humid air, frequent cloud cover, and tactical realities of close air support pushed engagements down to 10,000 feet and often much lower. Here, the P-38 faced an enemy perfectly adapted to the environment, the Mitsubishi A6N0. Introduced in 1940, the Zero had stunned Allied forces with its agility. Weighing barely 4,000 pounds empty, less than half the P-38's combat weight, it could outturn, outclimb, and outmaneuver every Allied fighter in the early war. Its lightweight construction, achieved by sacrificing armor and self-sealing fuel tanks, made it fragile but deadly in the hands of skilled pilots. Japanese naval aviators, many veterans of China's skies, had honed tactics that exploited the Zero's turning radius and slow speed control. American pilots were drilled relentlessly: never turn with a Zero. The official doctrine, disseminated through 5th Air Force tactical bulletins and reinforced in debriefings, was clear: use the P-38's speed, dive from altitude, make a single firing pass, climb away. Do not engage in horizontal turning fights. Do not allow the enemy to dictate the terms. Yet, in the chaos of combat, doctrine often dissolved. Zeros didn't fight fair. They flew in disciplined formations, using feints and reversals to lure P-38s into rolling turns. Once committed, the American pilot would find his aircraft sluggish, his roll response delayed by just enough to let a Zero slice inside his turn, line up a shot, and unleash a burst of 20mm shells into his engine or cockpit. Between July 1st and August 15, 1943, the 5th Air Force lost 37 P-38s over New Guinea and the Bismarck Sea. Most were attributed to pilot error in official reports. Few questioned the aircraft itself. After all, Lockheed's engineers had certified it. The manuals said it was sound. But on the flight line at Dobodura, where mechanics like James McKenna wiped sweat from their brows and signed off on maintenance logs with greasy thumbs, a different truth was taking shape. The problem wasn't the pilots. It was the machine, and a flaw so minor, so buried in tolerances, that only those who touched the cables with their bare hands could feel it. The P-38 Lightning's control system was a marvel of wartime engineering, and also its Achilles heel in low-speed combat. Unlike single-engine fighters with direct mechanical linkages from stick to ailerons, the P-38's unique twin-boom configuration forced a more complex routing. The pilot's control inputs traveled through cables that ran from the cockpit, down the fuselage, through the tail assembly, and then forward again along the inside of each boom to reach the ailerons on the outer wings. This loop added length, friction, and critically, slack. Factory specifications allowed up to 3/8 of an inch of cable play at full deflection. To Lockheed's engineers in Burbank, this was within acceptable tolerances. After all, at high speeds, above 300 miles per hour, the aerodynamic forces on the control surfaces dwarfed any minor lag. The aircraft responded crisply in dives and high-speed passes. But in the slow, turning fights that unfolded below 15,000 feet over New Guinea, that 3/8-inch slack translated into a perceptible delay. When a pilot yanked the stick hard left to roll into a turn, the aileron didn't move instantly. There was a fraction of a second pause as the slack was taken up, a delay so brief it wouldn't register on instruments, but long enough to be fatal in a dogfight. Japanese pilots knew this instinctively. They had studied the P-38's behavior through months of combat, a standard Zero tactic refined by veterans of the Solomons campaign, involved baiting an American into a rolling reversal. As the P-38 began its roll, the Zero pilot would snap roll in the opposite direction, exploiting the Lightning's sluggish response to cut inside its turning circle. Once on the P-38's tail, a Zero's light weight and superior turn radius made escape nearly impossible without altitude or speed, both often absent in the dense, low-altitude airspace over Papua. U.S. training tried to compensate. Pilots practiced zoom and boom attacks endlessly. They rehearsed emergency brake turns, scissor maneuvers, and split-S escapes. But muscle memory faltered under fire. When a wingman screamed "bandits" at 6 o'clock and tracers streaked past your canopy, Instinct often overrode doctrine. Pilots rolled to evade, and in that roll, the slack betrayed them. Maintenance crews noticed something the pilots couldn't articulate. Mushy controls, slow roll, feels delayed. These phrases began appearing in post-mission debriefs. Crew chiefs like McKenna, who performed daily pre-flight inspections, could feel the slack when they tensioned the cables by hand. They heard it too, a dull twang when plucked, unlike the sharp, taut ring of a properly tensioned system. Yet every time they reported it, the response was the same. Cable tension is within factory spec. No modification authorized. Lockheed was 7,000 miles away. The War Department's supply chain moved at the pace of cargo ships and C-87 transports. Engineering bulletins took weeks to arrive. Meanwhile, pilots kept dying. The 5th Air Force was under immense pressure. MacArthur demanded air superiority to support ground advances toward the Huon Peninsula. Every lost P-38 meant not just a dead pilot, but a gap in coverage over troops advancing through jungle trails. Morale in fighter squadrons plummeted. Replacements arrived green, some with fewer than 50 hours in the P-38 before their first combat mission. Many never flew a second. In this crucible of urgency and loss, the line between regulation and survival blurred. The P-38 was a magnificent machine, but it was killing its own pilots, not through failure, but through a design compromise masked as acceptable tolerance. And on a remote airstrip where the only law was survival, someone would soon decide that within spec wasn't good enough if it meant watching another boy from Iowa climb into a coffin with wings. That someone was Technical Sergeant James McKenna, a mechanic who knew that sometimes saving lives required bending the rules just enough to eliminate the slack in both the cables and the system. James McKenna was no officer, no engineer, no decorated war hero, at least not in any official ledger. A California native from Long Beach, he'd worked on Model Ts and flathead Fords before the draft pulled him into the Army Air Forces in 1942. By 1943, he was a technical sergeant in the 49th Fighter Group's maintenance squadron, stationed at Dobodura. His world was one of torque wrenches, oil cans, and the sharp scent of hydraulic fluid. But it was also one of faces of young pilots who joked during pre-flight checks, then vanished into the clouds, never to return. McKenna had signed off on the maintenance logs of at least 17 P-38s, whose pilots died in turning fights between June and August 1943. Each loss etched itself into his memory. He wasn't just maintaining machines. He was witnessing a slow-motion slaughter of men he'd shared coffee with hours before. That burden, the quiet knowledge that something was wrong, and that no one in authority would listen, drove him to act not as a soldier following orders, but as a human being, refusing to watch another friend die. The P-38's aileron control system was a textbook example of how wartime mass production could mask fatal flaws under the guise of acceptable variants. The control cables, made of high tensile steel, ran through pulleys anchored in the booms. Factory assembly allowed for minor slack to accommodate thermal expansion and assembly tolerances. But in the humid, high-vibration environment of New Guinea, that slack compounded. Humidity caused wooden pulley blocks to swell unevenly. Temperature swings altered metal tension. Repeated maneuvers stretched cables microscopically. Over time, the system degraded just enough to create a lag measured in milliseconds. But in aerial combat, milliseconds are lifetimes. Lockheed's static ground tests never replicated the dynamic stress of a hard roll at 180 miles per hour, with G-forces pulling at the airframe. McKenna, working daily on the aircraft, felt this degradation with his hands. He knew that within spec didn't mean optimal for survival. His solution, the Z-shaped piano wire tensioner, wasn't elegant engineering. It was field-expedient genius, a passive inline spring that applied 0.4 pounds of preload, eliminating slack without over-tensioning. It required no tools beyond pliers and wire cutters. It left no visible trace, and it restored near-instantaneous aileron response. Official U.S. fighter doctrine treated the P-38 as a high-altitude interceptor, not a dogfighter. But the Pacific theater dictated different rules. Japanese fighters operated in fluid, decentralized swarms, using terrain masking and cloud cover to ambush patrols. Engagements often began at medium altitudes, 10,000 to 15,000 feet, where the P-38's speed advantage was neutralized by the Zero's agility. Worse, Japanese pilots had learned to exploit American predictability. They'd stage decoy formations, lure P-38s into dives, then pounce from above with fresh aircraft hidden in cloud layers. When a P-38 pilot tried to reverse or scissor to evade, the aircraft's roll lag made him a sitting duck. The doctrine assumed pilots could always disengage, but disengagement required altitude or speed, both often unavailable in the chaotic, low-altitude free-for-alls over New Guinea. McKenna's fix didn't change doctrine. It gave pilots the control responsiveness needed to execute evasive maneuvers when doctrine failed. Suddenly, a split S, or a rolling reversal, became viable. Not because the pilot was better, but because the machine finally obeyed instantly. Within the rigid hierarchy of the Army Air Forces, innovation rarely flowed upward from enlisted mechanics. Engineering officers were trained to enforce specifications, not question them. At Dobodura, the base engineering officer, a stateside-trained lieutenant with no combat maintenance experience, dismissed McKenna's concerns in June 1943, citing Regulation 65-17, no field modification of primary flight control systems without Lockheed and Air Materiel Command approval. The process for formal redesign could take months. Meanwhile, pilots died weekly. This institutional inertia reflected a broader wartime paradox. The same bureaucracy that enabled mass production and logistical triumph also stifled grassroots problem-solving. Officers feared liability, supply irregularities, and the chaos of non-standard modifications. Yet the very survival of the 5th Air Force's fighter force depended on adaptability. McKenna's act of quiet defiance exposed a truth military leaders rarely admitted. In combat zones, enlisted technicians often understand their machines better than the officers who command them. His unauthorized fix was not rebellion. It was responsibility taken where authority had failed. For Japanese naval aviators, the Zero had been near mythical since 1941. Its dominance bred overconfidence. Pilots like those of the Tainan Air Group believed they could outmaneuver any Allied fighter, especially the clumsy P-38. Their tactics relied on precise timing, knowing exactly how long a lightning needed to roll, how wide its turn radius was. By August 1943, this timing had become second nature. But when modified P-38s began snapping into rolls faster than expected, that certainty fractured. Japanese after-action reports from late August note confusion. American aircraft responded abnormally quickly. Standard reversal tactic failed. Enemy maintained lead during rolling scissors. Veterans like Saburo Sakai, Japan's most famous living ace, found themselves nearly colliding with P-38s during maneuvers they'd executed flawlessly for years. The psychological impact was profound. If the P-38, a known quantity, could suddenly behave unpredictably, what else might the Americans have hidden? This uncertainty eroded the aggressive initiative that had defined Japanese fighter tactics. Pilots grew hesitant, less willing to press attacks. The hunter, for the first time, felt vulnerable. McKenna's decision to install the piano wire tensioner was not merely technical, it was deeply ethical. He faced a moral dilemma with no clean resolution. Follow regulations and watch Lieutenant Hayes likely die. Break them and risk court-martial, dishonorable discharge, or worse. If the modification failed, he could be blamed for a crash. Yet his oath as a mechanic was not just to the Army, but to the men who flew his aircraft. In the quiet of the hangar on the night of August 16th, with the hum of generators in the distance and the smell of tropical decay in the air, McKenna chose loyalty over compliance. His act embodied a wartime reality often overlooked, that heroism isn't always found in the cockpit. Sometimes it's found in the grease-streaked hands of a sergeant who risks everything to give a pilot one more second of control, one more chance to live. In a system that valued uniformity and procedure, McKenna's choice affirmed a deeper truth, that human life outweighs bureaucratic precision. 08:14 hours, August 17, 1943. Over the Huon Gulf, 13,000 feet above the churning turquoise waters. Lieutenant Robert Hayes's P-38 Lightning, call sign Lucky 7, banks hard to the right as his flight of 4 intercepts a formation of 9 Mitsubishi A6M Zeros. The morning sun blazes behind them, perfect positioning for a dive attack. Hayes, flying wing to Captain Ellis in the number 3 slot, locks eyes on a Zero trailing the enemy formation. He nudges his stick forward. The twin Allison engines roar as the Lightning plunges, accelerating to 380 miles per hour. Tracers from his wingman's guns stitch the sky ahead. Hayes lines up his shot. The red Hinomaru on the Zero's fuselage swells in his reflector sight. He fires. The nose-mounted battery, 450 caliber Brownings and a Hispano 20mm cannon, barks in unison. Tracers streak ahead, some sparking off the Zero's left wing. But the Japanese pilot is already reacting. In a blur of motion, he snap rolls right and dives, peeling away like a leaf in a storm. Instinctively, Hayes rolls to follow, and then he feels it. No lag, no mushy delay. The stick moves and the aircraft obeys, instantly. The roll is sharp, decisive, as if the P-38 had been waiting for his command. In half the time it normally took, Hayes is inverted, pulling through the horizon, his nose tracking the fleeing Zero. The enemy is still bleeding speed from his evasive dive. Hayes closes the distance. At 200 yards, he fires again. This time, the rounds walk up the Zero's fuselage, from tail to cockpit. A plume of flame erupts from the engine. The Zero pitches violently, rolls onto its back, and plunges toward the jungle canopy, trailing black smoke. Hayes's first kill. But there's no time to exult. Over the radio, his wingman's voice cracks. 2 Zeros diving on you. High 6 o'clock. Hayes glances up. 3. Zeros streak down in a shallow dive, engines screaming. They've seen him kill their comrade. Revenge is in their wings. Doctrine says, climb, run, use speed, but Hayes knows that with his current altitude and fuel state, climbing means being caught from behind. Running means giving them a perfect rear shot. In that split second, Hayes makes a decision that defies every training manual. He rolls hard left and pulls into a climbing turn directly toward the enemy. The modified aileron responds with shocking immediacy. The P-38 snaps around like a fighter half its weight. The lead Zero, expecting the usual sluggish roll, overshoots. For a heartbeat, he's exposed, his belly gleaming in the tropical sun. Hayes leads the target, fires. Cannon shells rip through the Zero's left wing root. The structure folds inward with a silent violence. The aircraft cartwheels into the void. 2 kills in 30 seconds. The remaining 2 Zeros attempt a classic scissor, alternating hard turns to force Hayes into an overshoot. But with his controls now razor-sharp, Hayes matches every reversal. The P-38 no longer fights him. It becomes an extension of his will. On the third exchange, 1 Zero bleeds too much speed in a tight turn. Hayes slices inside, closes to point-blank range, and empties his remaining ammo. The Zero disintegrates, a shower of metal and flame cascading past his canopy. Debris rattles against his right boom. 3 kills. The last Zero breaks off, fleeing eastward. Hayes, low on fuel and ammunition, does not pursue. He climbs back to 15,000 feet, reforms with the remnants of his flight, and turns for home. The entire engagement lasts 7 minutes. 09:03 hours. Dobodura Airfield. The P-38's engines wind down with a guttural sigh as Hayes taxis to the revetment. Dust swirls in the prop wash. He kills the ignition, removes his oxygen mask, and climbs down the ladder, legs trembling, flight suit soaked through with sweat. He doesn't head to debriefing. He walks straight to the maintenance line, where Technical Sergeant James McKenna stands beside a tool cart, wiping his hands on a rag that's long since surrendered to grease. Hayes stops a few feet away. His eyes lock onto McKenna's. No salute, no flourish. Just two words, hoarse but clear. It worked. McKenna nods once. No smile, no embrace. Just a slow, deliberate exhale, as if releasing a breath he'd held since 0100 that morning. He says nothing. He doesn't need to. But Hayes's fight hadn't gone unnoticed. From 15,000 feet above the Huon Gulf, Captain Frank Mitchell of the 475th Fighter Group had watched the entire engagement unfold. A veteran flight leader with 11 confirmed kills, Mitchell knew the P-38's limitations intimately. He'd lost wingmen to the same slow-roll death spiral. What he saw that morning defied logic. Hayes's lightning had reversed direction with a crispness Mitchell had never witnessed. Not in New Guinea, not even in stateside training films. It wasn't pilot skill alone. Something about that aircraft was different. Later that afternoon, Mitchell found Hayes in the sweltering debriefing tent, still shaking as he filled out his combat report. 3 zeros destroyed. Location: 13,000 feet over Huon Gulf. Time: 0814 to 821. Mitchell leaned in, voice low. "What'd they do to your plane, Hayes?" Hayes hesitated. Then, ask McKenna. Mitchell tracked McKenna down in Hangar 3, where the sergeant was elbow-deep in another P-38's oil cooler. Mitchell didn't mince words. "What did you do to Hayes's airplane?" McKenna looked up, saw the captain's earnest face, the fatigue around his eyes, the unspoken grief of lost pilots. He made a decision. He described the piano wire, its shape, its placement, its purpose. He admitted it was unauthorized. He warned of the risks: cable fatigue, potential jamming, court-martial if discovered. Mitchell didn't flinch. "Do mine tonight." That evening, under the same humid sky, McKenna repeated the ritual. 6 inches of salvaged piano wire, Z-shaped bend. Installed in the left boom. 8 minutes. No record. No witnesses. The next morning, Mitchell took off on patrol. He returned raving. "It rolls like a P-40 now, but with P-38 guns," he told his wingman. Word spread like wildfire through the ready rooms. Pilots began approaching their crew chiefs. "Did you hear about the wire?" Some mechanics refused, afraid of the consequences. Others, like Sergeant Rodriguez of the 80th Fighter Squadron, remembered Captain Morrison's death and said, "To hell with regulations." By August 20th, 9 P-38s at Dobodura flew with the hidden tensiones. Pilots reported near-instantaneous roll response. Kill counts rose. Survivability improved. The modification spread not through orders, but through trust. Pilot to pilot, mechanic to mechanic, in hushed tones over engine grease and coffee grounds. No paperwork documented it. No officer signed off. But in the skies over New Guinea, a silent revolution was underway. One piece of piano wire at a time. By early September 1943, the aerial balance over New Guinea had shifted in ways that defied official metrics but stunned those who lived it. In July, the 5th Air Force had lost P-38s at a rate of nearly 2 for every 0 destroyed, a grim testament to the mismatch between American doctrine and Japanese agility. But by the end of August, the ratio had improved to 1.3 to 1. By mid-September, American P-38 units were achieving a kill ratio better than 1 to 1 for the first time in the Pacific Theater. These were not flukes. They were concentrated in squadrons where the piano wire modification had quietly taken root. The change was most evident in pilot survival. Between August 17th and September 30th, only 4 P-38 pilots from Dobodura and Guinea, bases where the modification was widespread, died in turning engagements. Compare that to the 17 lost in the same period in July. Pilots who had previously returned shaken reporting mushy controls and delayed response, now spoke of aircraft that felt alive and answered instantly. Combat reports began featuring phrases like executed hard reversal, maintained turn inside enemy, and escaped overshoot, tactics previously deemed suicidal in a P-38. Japanese records tell a parallel story of unraveling confidence. The 11th Air Fleet's operational logs from late August note increasing pilot complaints, American Lightnings maneuvering with unexpected speed, standard turning tactics no longer effective, and difficulty predicting enemy roll timing. On September 3, Ace Saburo Sakai, credited with 64 kills, narrowly avoided a mid-air collision with a P-38 over Wewak when his attempted reversal was matched instantly by the American aircraft. In his post-war memoir, Samurai, Sakai would recall the encounter with bewilderment. The P-38 rolled as if it had no mass. I could not believe my eyes. Japanese intelligence scrambled for answers. They examined every captured or downed P-38. None showed visible alterations. Engines, guns, radios, all matched known specifications. The mystery deepened. Without understanding the cause, they could not adapt. Orders began filtering down from Rabaul. Avoid prolonged turning engagements with P-38s unless numerical superiority is assured. For a force that had prided itself on individual pilot skill and maneuver dominance, this was a psychological retreat. The Zero, once the undisputed king of the turning fight, was now being treated as vulnerable. Yet in American headquarters, no official notice was taken. Maintenance inspections continued to report all aircraft within tolerance. Crew chiefs had learned to remove the piano wire tensioners before scheduled checks and reinstall them afterward. A ritual of quiet subversion. Pilots knew. Mechanics knew. Even some flight surgeons noticed fewer reports of control lag-induced disorientation. But the chain of command remained blind, partly by design, partly by willful ignorance. After all, if the system worked, why ask how? The truth finally surfaced not through combat reports, but through routine bureaucracy. In October 1943, a maintenance inspector from the 5th Air Force's engineering section visited Dobodura to audit cable tension standards across P-38 squadrons. During a random check, he noticed inconsistent readings on several aircraft, tensions higher than factory baseline. Yet the planes showed no signs of structural stress or wear. Suspicious. He traced the anomaly to a small, Z-shaped piece of wire hidden inside the aileron control housing. He documented it, photographed it, and filed a report up the chain of command. The report landed on desks in Brisbane, then Washington. For 3 weeks, it circulated among officers torn between protocol and pragmatism. Regulation 6517 had been violated, repeatedly, systematically, across multiple units. Court-martials were theoretically possible. Yet the data was undeniable. Squadrons using the modification had significantly higher survival and kill rates. Pilots were living. Missions were succeeding. As one staff officer reportedly muttered, "If we punish them, we might as well shoot our own pilots." In November, Lockheed dispatched an engineering team to New Guinea. They tested the modification on a P-38J prototype, measuring cable loads, harmonic vibration, and aileron response time. Their conclusion, delivered in a terse technical memo dated December 3, 1943, was unequivocal. The inline tensioner eliminates control lag at low speeds without exceeding structural limits. It improves roll rate by 18% in turning maneuvers below 200 miles per hour. Recommend integration into production control system. Lockheed acted swiftly, starting with the P-38J model rolling off the Burbank line in December 1943, a factory-installed cable tensioner, functionally identical to McKenna's piano wire, became standard. The improvement was noted in pilot manuals, but never attributed to field improvisation. Official histories credited Lockheed engineering analysis and combat feedback loops. James McKenna's name appeared nowhere, nor did he seek recognition. After the war, he returned to Long Beach, opened a garage, and spent 42 years rebuilding engines. When asked about his service, he'd say only, "I was a mechanic. Fixed airplanes, that's all." Lieutenant Hayes survived the war, flying 63 missions and shooting down 11 enemy aircraft. Every August 17th, until McKenna's death in 2006, he called to say thank you. Captain Frank Mitchell rose to colonel, mentoring generations of Air Force maintainers with one refrain: the best ideas don't always come from the top. Sometimes they come from the guy with grease on his hands who won't stop watching his pilots die. The piano wire itself left no monument, but in the cockpit logs of surviving P-38 pilots, in the silent nods between mechanics at reunion halls, and in the altered design of every Lightning built after December 1943, it lived on, not as a weapon, but as an act of conscience. War is often remembered through grand strategies, famous generals, and decisive battles, but its true texture is woven in quieter threads, the choices made in shadows, the hands that work while others watch the sky. James McKenna never fired a gun in combat. He never wore a medal for valor. Yet in a humid hangar on a forgotten airfield, he altered the course of aerial warfare with 6 inches of piano wire and the courage to trust his own senses over a manual written thousands of miles away. His story is not unique, only unrecorded. Across every front of World War II, enlisted mechanics, radio operators, medics, and cooks made decisions that defied regulation but preserved life. They understood what bureaucracies often forget, that specifications serve people, not the other way around. McKenna's wire was more than a mechanical fix. It was a moral assertion that human agency matters, even in the rigid machinery of war. Today, his legacy endures not in archives but in principle. Modern fighter jets use fly-by-wire systems that eliminate mechanical lag altogether, but the lesson remains. Technology may evolve, but the tension between protocol and pragmatism, between authority and frontline insight, persists in every conflict. The P-38's hidden flaw was not in its design alone, but in the assumption that distant experts always know best. McKenna knew better, and because he acted, dozens of young men came home. In the end, that is the quietest and most enduring form of heroism.